we don't understand. And if you remember when we were talking about Habakkuk a couple weeks ago, that was Habakkuk's issue. He didn't understand. He had these questions for God. Why is this happening? When are you going to do something? Why are you going to do it this way? It's normal for us to not understand God because he's so much higher than we are. That's actually our first passage. If you look at Isaiah chapter 55, verses 8 and 9, would someone like to read Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9?
For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts.
Okay, so what does that mean in reference to the hard times that we go through? Or how can we trust God? Like, what does that passage tell us?
Whatever logical reasoning we've done is probably wrong about why things happen the way they do.
Right. That we lack perspective. I mean, and it's not necessarily any fault of our own. We aren't capable of having it sometimes. God is so much higher than we are. His ways, his thoughts. There's things that we cannot understand. A similar passage in Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. If you'll turn to Proverbs 3. And can someone read verses 5 and 6?
Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths.
All right. So, trust in the Lord with what? With all your heart. And don't what?
Lean on your own understanding.
So, between Isaiah 55 and Proverbs 3, I mean, it's a pretty clear picture of us compared to God. We don't understand. And we can't rely on our own understanding to go through life. And that's not what trust is either. That's not what faith is. Trust and faith, as we're going to see and talk about, is so much about not having the answers, not knowing, and doing what God says anyway.
I think that something that just kind of struck me in these two passages is it's not that there's no way for us to know how things fit together in this life. It's just to say that if we want to know, we need to learn from God's perspective through his word. Mm-hmm. So he gives us some answers, not all answers, but some answers. So it's not that we have to be in the dark.
Right.
We can read his word. So if we're adopting his thoughts, so to speak, from his word, then we can have a better understanding.
Yeah, there's different degrees of understanding. We'll get certain answers and not others. That's a good point.
It's interesting that you went to that verse in Proverbs, because when we read the Isaiah verse, I was about to say, and then we went to the next verse, what it made me think was we don't comprehend everything that God does or knows or why things happen necessarily, and so it's about trust. Mm-hmm. It's about trusting God and being able to do that. And we can study the Word, and we can gain an understanding of what God wants us to do. I think where we get into trouble in this type of a scenario is we expect everything to go the way we want it to go, and that's not God's plan or reasoning, and we don't necessarily understand that because we're living a physical life.
Right.
And so when we go through hard times, we're thinking of the here and now, and we don't understand necessarily God's bigger picture, and we have to have that trust and faith, like you just talked about.
Yeah,
that's the hard thing to do, but that's what's going to get us through.
Yeah, and what you're pointing out too is a lot of the intellectual and emotional things can kind of be mixed together because we don't separate those as humans, as people. Those things go together. So we can not understand it intellectually, or we can understand it intellectually but not understand it emotionally. Or maybe we can understand it emotionally and not understand it intellectually. So, Todd?
I think a lot that both of these passages show me, and especially I've spent so much time in Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. So often we live our life wanting a reason, or we want to fix. I've said for a long time, I'm a fixer. If there's something, there's a challenge, there's a problem, there's something wrong, I want to fix that. And I think there are times we plain and simply have to understand we're going to live in the I don't know, whether we like that or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. I think in this kind of topic, we like to compare, God over us as a parent over a child. And I think that's a good comparison. I mean, I would have to ask the room a lot more for that. I don't have the top part of that perspective. But I think also that the degree of difference between a parent and a child is much smaller than the degree between God and us. And I think it's hard for us to understand that sometimes because we are adults. We can think for ourselves, we can solve our own problems, we can handle life. But I think as much maybe as a child has trouble understanding this life, we have trouble understanding God's perspective and understanding the next life. I don't know if that's a perfect comparison, but made me think about it with what both of y'all just said. We got to move on a little bit. So as we study and discuss this further, we're going to see that trust is not just it's not just, not sure exactly what I was going to say there. It is a way of life. It's not something you do one time. Trust, and basically a synonym for it is faith, it is a way that we live. It's a way that governs all of the things that we do. It's not just like a one action type thing. It's not just you have trust when you are baptized. I trust God to save me, and that's it. Trust is a way that we live continually, day by day. Turn to Habakkuk chapter 3. We didn't get to cover Habakkuk chapter 3 a lot because I'm not the best at time management. So we're trying to be better about that this time. Habakkuk chapter 3, and starting at verse 2. You remember the first two chapters of Habakkuk, we kind of said briefly. He has all these questions for God, doesn't understand why God won't do anything about the evil that's happening in the nation of Judah. And God tells him he's going to use the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, I don't know what word that was that came out of my mouth, to judge them. And then Habakkuk doesn't really understand that either. So Habakkuk chapter 3, he finally starts to get it. If you actually look at chapter 2, verse 20, it says, "But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him." And we're going to hit on this idea a couple more times today and Wednesday. But I think there's something really significant there that Habakkuk says about keeping silence. He's been asking God these questions, and finally he realizes, I need to be quiet. But going on in chapter 3, it says in verse 1 that this is a prayer and a psalm. And he says in verse 2, "O Lord, I have heard the report of you, and your work, O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy." So we don't have time to read through the entire third chapter, just with some of the other things I'd like to cover. But basically, in this third chapter, he starts talking about all the things that God has done. And as far as something practical that we can gain from how to have better trust in God in hard times, this seems to be one of the best ways that people in the scriptures trust in God, is they remember what God has done for them in the past and for his people in the past. They look at God's character. So if you look also at verse 8, he says, "Was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord? Was your anger against the rivers, or your indignation against the sea, when you rode on your horses, on your chariot of salvation? And down in verse 13, you went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You crushed the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare from thigh to neck. So he's describing of this time where God worked salvation for his people, probably referring to the Exodus. There's several other passages in the scriptures, like especially in the Psalms, where they go through this kind of thing. God, you have done these things. You have saved your people in this way. Talking about God's character, his faithfulness, his unchanging nature. Look at Psalm 77, because this is a really similar one. Psalm 77. And would someone read verses 1 through 3 of Psalm 77, verses 1 through 3?
My voice rises to God, and I will cry aloud. My voice rises to God, and he will listen to me. In the day of my trouble I sought the Lord. In the night my hand was stretched out and did not grow weary. My soul refused to be comforted. When I remember God, then I am restless. When I sigh, then my spirit feels weak.
Okay, so how does this psalm start out? How would you describe so this is a psalm of Asaph. How would you describe how Asaph is feeling?
He's questioning. He's seems to be in a very low spirits, and he's not sure why things are the way they are.
Yeah. I mean, is it pretty believable that Asaph is going through a hard time when he writes this? I mean, I don't imagine he'd be writing this when he's going through, like, everything's going well for him. You know, something is not going well for him. He's struggling. And even in verse 3, when I remember God, I moan. I meditate and my spirit faints. He can't really think about God because he doesn't understand what's going on in his life, how God can let that happen. But then look down at verses 10 through 12. Then I said, I will appeal to this, to the years of the right hand of the Most High. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your wonders of old. I will ponder all your work and meditate on your mighty deeds. And he goes on to describe the Exodus, God working salvation for his people, redeeming them from slavery in Egypt. So you start out with the conflicted, broken, just dismal despair. That's what's going on. That's what he's feeling. And at least one solution to that is remembering what God has done. And that's just something you see time and time again. We see it in Habakkuk. We see it here in Psalm 77. And there's a lot of Psalms that do the same thing. They remember what God has done. But maybe we still don't understand why suffering is necessary. Like, okay, once we're suffering, we understand that we can look back at God and be like, okay, I understand that God's going to get me through it, that he's going to deliver me, that it's going to get better at some point. But doesn't necessarily answer why suffering itself happens anyway. So, I mean, if we look at the cross, maybe we don't know the reason why we're suffering, but we know what the reason isn't. If we look at the cross, we know the reason for our suffering is not that God doesn't love us, because God loved his son, and he still suffered. So, like I said at the beginning, this is a really big topic, and it's hard to cover everything, and it's hard to really get a concrete answer for any of it. There's things that we can do to help us trust in God better, but it's a hard thing, especially with our minds and our hearts wrestling with it at the same time. But as far as for God's people and Christianity, it's realistic. There's no portrayal or indication that it's easy or that we're not going to suffer. Christ made it very, very clear that those who followed him would suffer. And terrible things happen to good people. They happen to Jesus. So it goes back to that expectations. Are we expecting things to just go well for us? And we'll talk a little bit more about that with Job, because maybe he had some expectations of things continuing to go well for him. What did you have to say, Ben?
You mentioned the cross, and I think that's where we have to focus this discussion. I think it's interesting that although the Bible gives us great answers as to the question of why is there suffering and pain and so forth, Christianity gives a better answer to that question than anything else. And yet, at the same time, the emphasis of the Scripture is not so much the intellectual exercise of understanding why, it's more the practical application of here's how you endure suffering. The cross does explain suffering, but in terms of quantity of information given in the Scriptures, there's a lot more about Jesus came to show you how to suffer, and you do that along with him.
Yeah. Well, I guess I don't need to say anything else. That's pretty good. Yeah, that's a really good point, that we don't necessarily have the answers for suffering.
And another way to just think about it is, I think oftentimes for us, this is more of an intellectual exercise.
Mm-hmm.
And yet in the Scriptures, it's not so much intellectual as it is practical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I've definitely been trying to think through this the last couple weeks, like come up with an answer, and really through all this studying realizing more and more that there isn't one, at least not one that's ever going to satisfy me completely, ever one that's going to make me stop questioning or wondering. Only reasons not to let that completely make me lose my faith. Go ahead.
I just think this passage in Psalm 77, him remembering, I think that's important, because if you think of, look back on Israel going wayward, it's almost always centered around, well, they forgot God, or they stopped thinking about God and what he'd done for them. And I think in our own personal lives, it's very easy to do that. It's very easy to have a difficult time, cry out to God, pray to God. Okay, you get through that time, things are back to normal, and then it's so easy to just very quickly forget what he did and what you went through and what he got you through.
Mm-hmm.
Just like Israel, and just forget God. It's,
Yeah.
So I think remembering is crucial in our own personal lives, not just looking back at stories in the Scripture.
Yeah, that was, Israel continually, consistently forgot God. That was the whole cycle. They would cry out to him when things were going poorly for them, and then God would deliver them, and they would, be happy about that, but then really quickly they would just forget about God. There was a passage that we're not actually going to go through, but in Numbers 21, when the people are complaining and they say, let's go back to Egypt, like they do so many times, God sends these fiery serpents to bite them, and they're dying from it. And so he has Moses make the bronze serpent. Well, I just noticed that because I was looking for examples of trust. And so Hezekiah, King Hezekiah of Judah, there's a verse, I think it's 2 Kings 18 and verse 5, where it says that he was the king of Judah that trusted in God more than any other king. More than any other king. King Hezekiah trusted in God. And it says something about how he destroyed the bronze serpent that Moses had made because the Israelites had started worshiping it. So God had made that for them to look upon, and they were still going to get bit, but they could be saved when they wouldn't die from it if they would look up at that serpent. That required trust and faith in God that wouldn't still happen, they wouldn't still die from it if they looked at that snake like he told them to. And then they end up just worshiping it, which is the whole cycle. That's what Israel constantly did. They just turned the things, and they turned their trust from God into the things that he provided for them, which is a big danger for us to beware of. We don't want to trust in, for them it was the bronze serpent, but for us it could be our finances, our houses, and so many things that God's provided for us that we can trust in those things. We trust in our houses to protect us from the storm, rather than God. It's once you start thinking about it, it's not that hard to see the parallels between what we shift our trust to rather than God. So some examples of people who, this would have been a lot easier to do up here. This is probably the hardest thing for me to cover without the PowerPoint, because I had the example of like who the person was and then what they'd gone through. I don't have any of that. So we have a couple different examples. There's Joseph, who's one that would probably stick out in our minds pretty well, about someone who had a lot of hard times in life, who suffered a lot. He was sold into slavery, he was thrown into prison, he was forgotten about, and left to rot in prison when he interpreted the guy's dream and asked him to remember him, and he didn't remember him. So a lot of bad things happened to Joseph. Then there's Paul, and that verse, I can't remember exactly where it is, where he talks about all the bad things that have happened to him, the imprisonments and countless beatings, and he's often near death and lashes and stoning and shipwreck and danger from all these different types of things, people and places, toil and hardship, sleepless nights, hunger and thirst, cold and exposure. Basically, anything bad you can possibly think of happened to Paul. So there's Joseph, there's Paul, there's David and the affliction he had with his son Absalom, with Saul trying to kill him, and just a lot of different things that happened in his life. And then specifically, as we've covered with Habakkuk, right at the end of Habakkuk, because we didn't cover this super well, so look at Habakkuk 3 real quick again. Habakkuk 3 and verse 17. And I just want you to see this one verse. That is really Habakkuk's greatest expression of trust and faith. Habakkuk chapter 3 and verse 17. I guess verses 17 through 19. He says, "Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, and the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places." So even though there's no food, literally no food, you look at what he's listing, it's like every source of food that they had. It's all gone. That's what he's saying. You know, with the captivity coming, that's what's going to happen. No food, no provision. That's what, and this impending captivity and destruction, all this is coming. So all these examples of people that these bad things are coming from. But then they later realize, Joseph in Genesis 50 in verse 20, he says, "But God meant it for good." So all the bad things that happened to him, God meant it for good. Paul says in Philippians chapter 1 that his imprisonment that he was going through served to advance the gospel. And a little bit later down he says that Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. David says in Psalm 119 and verse 71 that he was glad that he was afflicted because he was able to learn God's statutes. And Habakkuk here, even though all these things are happening and he doesn't necessarily have an answer, but still he's going to rejoice in the Lord. So different degrees of time, but they start to realize that the good that's coming out of it, that like it's hard to see the benefits like when we're going through it, when we're in it, but then later down the line, a lot of times we can see what good God brought about by that. So really what this is, what perspective we're talking about, is learning to have an eternal perspective, because we see things in a worldly way. We don't have time to cover the whole chapter like right now today, but I would really encourage you to read Romans 8. Romans 8 is full of really good ideas concerning trust in God, and we'll look at a couple of them. Romans 8 verse 18 says, Paul says, "I consider that the sufferings of the present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us." So everything all the bad things that are going on right now, it's not worth comparing. Down in verse 28, he says, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose." Which it's so hard to see that in the moment. Like, we're going through hard times. Things work together for good. I mean, maybe we think of that eternally, and that probably is the case. It's certainly no guarantee that all things work together for good in this life. But in the moment, when we're going through pain and hard times, that's hard to see, that all things are going to work together for good. But that's also kind of the point, isn't it? That it's hard to see it, right? We lack that sight. God doesn't see as we see. That's one of the biggest contrasts between us and God, is the way that we see. And part of what suffering is doing, part of what these hard times are doing, is teaching us not to be guided by what we see, but what we don't see. It's teaching us to see things not just from a physical perspective. It's teaching us not to walk or live by sight, but by faith. Walk by faith, not by sight. So a couple more of those passages. Romans 8, verses 24 through 25. This is about living a life characterized by faith, hope, and trust. For in this we were saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. Again, there's that idea of waiting and patience. 2 Corinthians 4, verses 16 through 18. So we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. And then, of course, Hebrews 11, verses 1 and 2. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. All these passages are talking about what we don't see. We're so focused on what we do see. And I think that's a big part of trusting God in hard times. We're so focused on what we do see. We need to focus on what we don't see. We can't see God. We can't see all the good that He's bringing about. We can't see the end, that He is working all this together for good. We can't see all that. We need to focus on the things that we cannot see. Are there any more comments or questions? I couldn't quite cover everything I had, but this has been still a good discussion. I just want to get any other comments, questions, and nothing? Got to be something. All right, well, on Wednesday, we're going to talk a little bit more about the heart side. I'm still not going to reveal that word to you. You have to be here on Wednesday to find out what it is. But thank you for your participation.